well known. You all know that they're on the panel because they were former governors of the Reserve Bank. But they have much more than that in common. They're intellectual heavyweights, have been in public policy making in India for decades. They're bringing experience from India, from around the world. Therefore, we are very fortunate to have three very formidable panelists. I must also say that this is a very unusual setting for me, because as the governor, you all know that I am all the time having to answer questions. This time round, I'm having the rare and perverse privilege and joy of asking questions. Today's session is on India's economic prospects, perhaps looking ahead. That's what I read that as. But you cannot look ahead without looking back. So what I propose to do is to spend about 10 to 12 minutes looking back, spend about half an hour looking at the current situation, and spend about 15 to 20 minutes looking ahead on India's economic prospects. I will be asking the questions and the panelists will answer them, and there'll be some opportunity for the audience to. Actually, if you look at India's situation today, it's easy to despair. Growth has moderated, inflation is high and stubborn, our external situation is vulnerable, investment has crumbled, and there's a widespread sense of despair about the quality of governance. But some people say that that's too much of cynicism. If you take a longer view, if you look back, take the big picture, there are very significant achievements of the economy. So, sir, Dr. Rangarajan, my first question to you on this big question, big picture, is can you please identify two significant achievements of the economy? I won't say in the last 20 years because that's the reform process. In the last 10 years, two significant achievements of the economy.
Well, as you said, the Indian economy is currently passing through a very difficult phase. Growth has slowed down and inflation remains high. So too are the current account deficit and the fiscal deficit. But these developments should not cloud the fact that in the 7-year period beginning 2005-06, the average rate of the growth of the Indian economy has been 8.3%. Nor should we overlook the structural changes that have occurred in the Indian economy in the last 2 decades. I think 1991 is an important landmark in the post-independent economic history of the country. And the country faced an acute economic crisis triggered by a balance of payments problem. And the crisis was converted into an opportunity to bring about fundamental changes in economic policy. Therefore, we have seen the full benefits of the growth in the last 1 decade. The average rate of growth is 8.3%, and the per capita income has been growing at around 7% per annum. So this is a fact that we need to keep in mind. I think the Indian economy came to slowing immediately after the international financial crisis, but that is after the economy growing at a rate exceeding 9% for 3 consecutive years. And the recovery from that was also very quick because both in 2009-10 and 10-11, we had the growth rate picking up at 8.4%. Last year we have seen the economy slowing down, and there are indications the economy would be slowing down further. But I will come back to it if there is an opportunity. But one other point that I want to make at this stage is that if you look back, what has been happening is the extraordinary and the very fast increase in the post-liberalization period in the savings and the investment rate. In 2007-08, the savings rate was 36% and the investment rate was 38%, which even with an incremental capital output ratio of 4:1 would give you a 9% rate of growth. Therefore, the growth has been strong, but we need to look at the factors which have contributed to the slowing down of the growth in the recent period. I will come back to it if you give an opportunity later. And also the thing is the strong investment growth, the very high peak that we reached in 2007-8. It has fallen since then. The government savings rate have come down because of the rise in the fiscal deficit, and because of inflation, the household savings, particularly in financial assets, has come down. Therefore, we need to reverse both this declining trend in the savings rate and the investment rate. But I would say that the two strong things that have happened is the maintenance of high growth, and which has been facilitated by a very high savings and investment rate. Of course, all of this will translate into economic growth only if you have the right atmosphere, and that is what the reform agenda has done.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir, for that very broad brush answer. Sets the ball rolling, and I will have more questions for you on that. Now, my big picture question to Dr. Jalan, sir, you came into the Reserve Bank with a lot of rich and varied experience in the government. You were in the Reserve Bank, you were in international institutions, you were a member of parliament for 6 years. You wrote several books. You are one of the foremost public intellectuals in the country today. So, Dr. Rangarajan spoke about the strengths of the economy, but I'd like you to look back over the last 10 years and identify two significant public policy failures over the last 10 years.
Thank you very much, Subbarao, for very kind words. Since this is the first time I'm speaking, I must also take your permission to thank Mr. Mahendra Dev to have organized this wonderful function. This morning, what I listened to was just tremendously thought-provoking and superb speeches. I was just telling Mr. Subbarao, the present governor, that I didn't realize that the governors could speak so well. And we usually pass on that task to somebody else, but he had a brilliant speech. And of course, Rangarajan, I have heard him in different capacities, and another brilliant speech. And then the IGIDR chief. So it was a most thoughtful, excellent session, and I must congratulate you, Mahendra Dev. I have been associated myself with the IGIDR for a very, very long time, not only in capacity as from the RBI, but also well before that from the governmental finance ministry and chief economic advisor. And I remember Rajiv Gandhi's coming here to inaugurate in 1987. I was here too in a different capacity. And I had escorted him. It was just a wonderful experience. And so, sorry to, you asked me to talk about weaknesses. I thought I would start with what is the major strength of India is to have an assembly like this, to discuss economic prospects and so on. Now, if you ask me about weaknesses of what is that you have talked about growth, the biggest weakness, which is a long-term weakness, not a short-term one, is really the fact, and it depresses me, and I'm sure it depresses you, when you think about that poverty. We have seen incomes rising, but inequality also not decreasing. I'm using the word in a negative sense, and one can say the per capita incomes have increased a little bit more in the last 10 years and so on. But it's very frustrating that a country with so many strengths, with a democracy which is so well functioning, with savings rate and investment rate that Dr. Rangarajan talked about, that with so much going on in our favor, and one of the chief achievements of, looking back, and as you said, that I've been involved in governmental activities for a very long time, is that as you know, up to about 91 or so, even 95, and I remember it so well during the Asian crisis, which occurred in 97, when unfortunately I was just walking into RBI and I didn't know what to do, is that somehow balance of payments issues have taken a back seat, and which is good. We were perpetually handicapped, and as I recall, with balance of payments problems of a very intense kind. Some of you who are here would remember. We used to have this Aid India consortium every year And from the finance ministry, when I was in finance ministry, I used to visit all the developed countries just before the Aid India consortium, convincing them that, we need help and so on and so forth, and and so on, that we would reform. And so that is one thing which we don't have. And yet, so you don't really can't see anything which can inhibit India. You are in the bottom 1/3 of Human Development Index. If you look at malnutrition, if you look at, I'm sorry to bring this issue, and the primary issue is not economics to my mind. And I'm sorry to say so, that it is not only economics plus, but I think we now have to think of economics minus. That what is it that we need to do to improve the whole structure of governance, which has a colonial legacy of a type which hasn't changed, which in the political era, political dimension, it has become worse. And in the administrative dimension, it is the same. The whole system that you can't deliver, you can't, you can't deliver, simply can't deliver. It's not a budgetary problem. It's a totally different problem. Sorry that I've taken long, but I want to put my finger is that you do not, to my mind, it's not a question of reforms and economics, which we will get, and they are, at the macroeconomic level, that they will happen, because India has certainly arrived. There is no weakness. But what is it, and why is it that this particular issue persists and that we need to tackle? And therefore, I would say that what we need in economics minus is to do something about the politics of India and to do something about the administration of India, which I know that this is not the forum in which you would like to discuss it, but since you have talked about this being development and not finance and not economics, I think this is an issue of utmost importance.
Thank you very much, sir. Now to Dr. Reddy. Dr. Reddy has set an exacting role model for the governors of RBI. Now, over the last 4.5 years, he's set an exacting model for ex-governors of RBI. He's been an intellectual powerhouse even after he left the Reserve Bank. And he's known in the Reserve Bank and wherever he worked for looking at the big picture, addressing micro issues from a macro perspective. You heard Dr. Rangarajan say about the strengths of the economy, as I got them. They were the high growth trajectory that we proved we can get on to. He spoke about the savings and investments. And Dr. Jalan, when I asked him about significant failures, he painted a larger picture of public administration and governance and politics. But specifically, he talked about our growth being not sufficiently poverty sensitive. And he also talked about the vulnerability of our external sector. So, amalgamating those strengths and weaknesses, and if we look back over the last 10 years, what two big mega trends do you see in the economy? Mega trends that will influence our growth and our poverty reduction strategies?
Thank you very much, sir. First of all, I must express my gratitude to IGIDR for organizing this excellent event. And I have had official association for 11 years with IGIDR, of course not as long as you were saying. So again, I'm grateful to Governor also for giving me this opportunity. First, I think I would agree about the savings and investment being the most significant achievement. But on the same logic, that there is a dip in both in the recent years. I think that should be the worrying part. It was growing over a period, and then last 2 to 3 years, the savings are down, household savings are down. The economy is being driven by consumption demand than by investment demand. So we only hope that this is a pause. And I think public policy has to give maximum attention to how to revive savings and investment to maintain. I mean, whatever other issues. I would say essentially, granted that in this modern world of rapid portfolio flows, you cannot afford more than current account, significantly large current account deficit for too long. Growth will be determined by domestic savings and domestic investment plus productivity. So I would entirely agree with Dr. Rangarajan, and that is the critical challenge going ahead. There has been achievement till recently. That will be the most critical challenge for the future, in particular household savings, in particular household financial savings, because the behavior of the household financial savings seems to indicate that the households do not have faith in the financial markets except banks. It's not a good sign, whatever we are developing. So I think that's one part, I would say. Second, I would say most again important for the future is what Dr. Jalan Sahab said. It's the external sector. External sector, when we achieved the high growth till 4-5 years ago, global economy was very benign. Global economy was very benign. Now, if you look at the next 5 to 10 years, I think global economic situation is, if not frightening, certainly full of uncertainties, certainly full of volatilities. In such a situation, given our socio-political structure, I think we have to be extremely sensitive to the possible shocks that will emanate from the global economy. So I would say from now on, the medium-term challenge, domestic, enhance savings and investment, external, build buffers against possible shocks. Even the latest report of the World Economic Outlook, October 12, virtually says so, and it even uses the word night and uncertainty. If that is what the IMF feels, that there is night and uncertainty over the medium to long term, I think there's something that we have to do about it. So I would say these two are most important.
Thank you very much, sir, for synthesizing those answers and giving your own views. At this point, I want to give a brief opportunity to the audience to ask one and only one question to one panelist, but that question has to be on the last 10 years, not looking ahead, but looking back over the last 10 years. Yes, from India today, yes, please.
Not any longer, sir.
Not any longer, yes.
I wanted to ask, and I don't want to show any bias. 4 of my gurus are sitting there, so I will try and not be accused of any bias, but is the 5 point something the new Hindu rate of growth?
So I will request each of the panelists just half a minute on that 5.3% new Hindu rate of growth. So would you like to go first?
I don't think so. I think we are passing through a phase of decline in growth rate. But my own estimate for this current year is that perhaps the growth rate will be around between 5.5 and 6. We can't exactly locate it, but it will be. But going ahead, I don't see any reason why that we should get stuck at 5.3 or even 5.5. I mentioned about the decline in the savings and investment rate. That need not necessarily be that that we should stay at that in that direction. There is every possibility of the investment and the savings rate going up, and we should work towards it. And I think unlike the earlier time, when we talked about 3.5% being a fatalistic rate of growth, we had not seen very high growth rates, but we have seen for 3 consecutive years a rate of growth exceeding 9%. Now, if you had it only 1 year, I can call it a freak. It is not a freak. That we had the ability to sustain it over a 3-year period. And therefore, it is not difficult to get back to that. Of course, there are problems, and later on, if we can discuss what needs to be done in order to do it. But quite clearly, the savings rate can be picked up, raised, because if the fiscal consolidation program picks up, it can do it. And if inflation can be tamed, I believe that the disaffection towards financial assets, which households have been showing, can also be remedied. Therefore, I think that the possibility of the savings and investment rate going up from the decline level to the levels that we had seen earlier is a possibility. And therefore, I do not accept the idea that we are stuck at 5.3 or 5.5. We can look ahead to a faster rate of growth. That will take some years. I'm not saying that we're going to get it next year or something. Probably next year we may be between 6 and 7. And the following year, we could get to 8%. But there are a few things that we need to do. I only say that after all, under the same reform regime, we were able to get 9% plus for 3 years. I mean, the reform regime has not worsened. We need reforms in many areas. We need to improve. But it has not worsened. Therefore, it is always possible to get back to that.
Thank you, sir. So, Hindu versus secular rate of growth.
No, I hope you popularize that term, because then we will get out of it. Because we have all the ingredients of success. The only thing is how to put it together in a secular framework, as it were. So I personally think, compared with, every decade, if you see, we have had years of high growth and then years of low growth after, say, 70, 78 or 79. But my point is simply this, that in terms of potential, I completely agree with Dr. Rangarajan. But there are basic issues, fundamental issues, which I'm sorry, I am obsessed with, is that it is a systemic crisis that India is going through. It's not economic. It is in different spheres, which if there is time, if you want, I can elaborate on. But that's an obsession. India, nobody can stop India in economic terms, purely economic terms. But the system is breaking down.
Dr. Reddy, you, sir?
Yes, sir. I believe what I may call the old Hindu rate of growth was actually achieved was about 3.5, around 3.5 to 4. I would say the new Hindu rate of growth will be double that, 7 to 8. Let me explain why. First, pre-crisis, when we achieved 9%, there was benign factors globally. There were a congruence of good policy atmosphere within the country. Post what I may call the new normal of the global economy is likely to be a little less benign. For the simple reason, if it is equally so, then it may result in a bubble. So if the new normal global economy is going to be slightly less than what it was pre-crisis, and even assuming that the Indian policy is as good as it has been, then we are somewhere below 9%. But certainly the current level of is certainly far lower than potential output, likely output. Almost certainly the central scenario, I would say, is 7 to 8. Cyclical, yes, possible. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Actually, the discussion went a little ahead of what I planned, but just as well that a lot of questions that I was going to ask have already been anticipated and answered. I also saw several hands going up, and I will, depending on the time, call you. But I'd like to see some hands going up in the second half of the hall as well from the students and the research scholars at some point of time in this discussion. Shubda. Will you indicate to which panelist? Except the governor. Okay.
Perhaps to all. Is gold today a boon or a curse for India?
What?
Is gold today a boon or a curse for India? So would you like to comment on that?
No, I don't have any gold.
You don't have any gold, but that's the reason you perhaps must comment. What about Dr. Reddy, sir? Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I think, personally, I feel all prejudice against gold is gender preference. If Mercedes-Benz can be imported, if aftershave lotion can be imported, why not gold? Secondly, it is both an investment good and a consumption good. It's actually used as both. Many people seem to mistake that it is only a hedge against inflation. And finally, who is SUVs, energy intensive use? Huge subsidy, huge BOP. Why are we not taking action against that? Therefore, I think we have to take not a judgmental view, not a paternalistic view. There is a demand for it. It's being imported. If you can, try to stop it. We tried, we can't. For a longer term, yes, we can keep trying. And if I may take the liberty of a private conversation, sir, with my guru, Dr. Rangarajan. Long back when and I don't think there's anybody who knows more about gold in the history of India gold management than Dr. Rangarajan. But I may be anticipating what you say, sir, but I will share it in your presence. When we were discussing, finally he said one day, Venu, my wife always wanted to buy a little gold. I always used to dissuade her. I thought it was a foolish idea. At the end of it, I realized she was right. Thank you.
Well, I believe that the propensity to buy gold or to have gold is deep-rooted in India. And I think it is ineffective to fight against it. But there is certainly an increased demand for gold that we have seen in recent years, which is to some extent because of the high level of inflation. For example, last year, the total import of gold was about $60 billion. And if you look at the import of gold in the previous years, it has been ranging in the period of $30 to $40 billion. Therefore, last year, an additional $20 billion or some $15 to $20 billion has been imported, partly because of the high level of inflation and treating gold as a hedge against inflation. And I believe that gold import can come down to more normal levels as inflation also comes down. But I must also say that all the efforts to ban the import of gold will be a bad idea, and that will only result in smuggling. I want to refer to it. I headed, I don't know, 2 committees or something like that on gold earlier. I decided, and then it was only after that the gold policy was changed to lift the ban on import of gold. I am being told that even after the raising of the excise duty on gold, there are indications that smuggling has increased in the last 3 months. I think there are, the Revenue Department has given me some numbers which indicate that the seizure of gold in the last 3 months has been higher, which is an indication of how much gold that is being smuggled in. Therefore, I would say, yes, to some extent we should dissuade people from holding an asset which does not give a rate of return. But you can't go beyond a particular point. The number of weddings in this country is not going to decrease. If anything, it will only increase. And therefore, the gold demand will be there. But to the extent to which we can moderate inflation, we certainly can reduce the abnormal increase in the import of gold that we have seen last year.
Thank you very much for those answers. I don't intend to answer these questions or engage in a debate on particularly gold as I represent the Reserve Bank, but I just want to clarify because this is an appropriate point. The Reserve Bank has been engaged in gold imports and people saving in gold for a number of reasons, because we're concerned about macroeconomic management. We're concerned about gold as a means of saving because, as Dr. Rangarajan said, it locks up savings. We're concerned about gold, lending against gold by non-bank finance companies because of financial stability concerns. And we've been concerned about gold from an external management perspective because of the pressure it puts on current account or capital account, depending on how you account for it. Those are the 3 dimensions of our concern about gold. But one thing I want to clarify, which is that the Reserve Bank has not put any fresh restrictions on import of gold. We've said that banks cannot lend for purchase of gold, but that is reiteration of an instruction that has been on the book for several decades. This is not a fresh restriction. We've told banks not to lend for purchase of gold, which is a standing instruction which has just been reiterated. I just want to stop that there. Perhaps we'll come back to gold discussion when we get to external sector issues. I saw Professor Srinivasan's hand go up, and I'm sure that he wants to ask a question, but before I let him ask a question, I want him to answer a question. which is, Dr. Jalan referred to our growth not being poverty sensitive. There's there's somewhat of a widespread view that even as we've clocked growth, that's not been inclusive enough, and the poverty reduction of that growth has been less than it should have been. You're an international expert, in particular, you looked at India and China. Can you tell us in a couple of minutes what we should learn from China in terms of translating growth to poverty reduction? Your mic, sir. Will you kindly stand up and speak so that those behind you can... do you have a problem in doing that? No, then please, forgive me, please keep seated.
I will try. In one sentence, China's policy, broadly speaking, on utilization of labor and the labor markets and the labor-intensive manufactured goods, those for domestic consumption and exports, differentiates us from them. And if you view poverty as a phenomenon that affects mostly the employment opportunities that we are able to provide for the poorer sections of the population, that's what I would argue. That's the difference between India and China. As far as my question to the distinguished panel is, I think Dr. Rangarajan is exaggerating the importance of the 3-year over 9% rate of average growth we had ending in 2007, 2008. That by no means indicated that the 9% was sustainable in the future, looking forward from there. If you look at the national accounts data, the quarterly data, for the slowdown started in the last or the third quarter of 2007, 8, if I remember right. And but for the further dip during the financial crisis and the recovery, there is no change in the downward trend in the growth rate, it seems to me, quarterly data that started earlier. That indicated to me there are deeper constraints in the economy that prevented the 9% rate being sustainable, and that would make it difficult to resume 9% rate anytime soon. Dr. Reddy may be absolutely right that the former Hindu rate of growth is now higher, but that's not the vantage point that you want to get back to.
Would you like to comment on this, or should we?
All right, okay, I'll comment. No, I think the rate of growth that we sustained in the 3-year period is not only just an average of 9%, it is much more. Yes, we had, as Dr. Reddy also mentioned, several favorable factors operating at that time. The global environment particularly was very conducive. Now, one is not really saying that we can very easily get back to that 9%. After all, if this is a cyclical peak, perhaps it will come down in the later years. But I believe that the rate of growth in the savings rate growth and the investment rate growth was a sustained increase. And therefore, if what has happened in the 3-year period of decline is reversed, either because of a fiscal consolidation program or because of the inflation coming down lower, I think that it is possible to get back to if not in the 9%, but the 8% rate of growth. I'm not saying again it is something immediate, not the next year, but over the next 5 years, I think we can, over the latter half of the 5-year period, we should be able to get to 8%. But there are a number of things that need to be done. I'm not saying that you keep quiet and then you will get your 8%. There are some things to be done. But it is not something that I will go a little further beyond Dr. Reddy's doubling of the doubling. If you take 3.57 is a good rate. 78, I would rather go to a 78 as the problem grade. I think this potential rate of growth is something that really need to be discussed, because all these filters that people use is all based upon the end year figure. And therefore, one has to be very careful in arriving at the potential rate of growth. In fact, when you are looking ahead, you really have to see how much of the circumstances can be replicated. Unless you feel that those circumstances cannot be replicated, there is no reason to feel why we cannot get to 8%.
Thank you, sir. I had a question on potential growth rate. I decided not to raise that because we can get into a lot of technical discussion on that, but I want to assure you that the Reserve Bank is deeply engaged in identifying the potential growth rate, which is quite distinct from the aspirational growth rate. But Dr. Jalan, I want to bring you into the discussion at this point because Dr. Rangarajan said a lot of things need to be done to raise the growth rate. In the Reserve Bank, you're known for striking the right balance between growth and inflation. A lot of people have told me, look at Dr. Jalan. He wasn't all an inflation hawk. He wasn't all for growth. He got the right balance, and you must learn from him. So now if you got to raise the growth rate, I'm saying in the short term, long term we know a lot of things, but in the short term, got to raise the growth rate. 3 things that need to be done. I was going to ask you 3, but I'll ask you only 2. But because one I know and everyone knows, which is that the Reserve Bank must cut rates. Okay, but apart from that, 2 other things that we should do to rev up the growth engine in the short term.
I think needless to say in this assembly of high intellectuals and readers and so on, that there are periods when growth is more important, that you take policy measures to boost growth. There are periods where you have to control inflation because that is the dominant public issue. So there will be periods when you take measures, however harsh they are, to control inflation, and you take measures to promote growth, however difficult they are to implement to promote growth. So I'm not getting into that problem of growth versus inflation. It is a question that all of us want to have growth and inflation, that is high growth or reasonably high growth, 7-8% rate of growth, with say the kind of target that you have set in the RBI for 5% in our environment of inflation. But what is the priority would vary from time to time, and then you have to take measures which are strong. The problem that I see with us is that unless you have, and sorry that you raised this whole issue of what was happening when I was around in the Reserve Bank, when we were faced, the first thing that I remember as I was going down the Marine Drive, I didn't know about the Asian crisis then, but suddenly struck with the Asian crisis before I entered the Reserve Bank. And that was an issue which you can only believe in retrospect as to how difficult it was to handle. Our total reserves were 20 billion at that time, not too bad compared with the past, but 20 billion. Rupee, strong attack on the rupee, thinking that we can't defend it, and it was depreciating. Those who were involved in, I'm sure that some of you must have been watching on the screen, unfortunately the electronic screen has also come, where the moment the markets opened, if you saw depreciation, it would go out of hand. And then RBI would intervene, then it didn't have the resources, and so on and so forth. You lost 3, 4, 5 billion in a week, if I remember it right. And some of you who are present here would remember. Now, the most problem is not how did we handle it? We handled it. But it was a completely harmonious relationship between the RBI and the government in tackling a most difficult set of problems, which is, and I can tell you, in this assembly, I don't want to be it was the most difficult period in certain ways. And to convince and I remember it was United Front government in those days, in 1997, with none other than the present finance minister as the finance minister of India, who had sent me to the Reserve Bank. I'm sorry to be autobiographical here, but, and then it was succeeded by the BJP. And the first thing I remember, the moment they took office, there were 2 of their leaders, I can mention their names also, with their political leaders, not Atal Bihari, but two of the other who talk about this, that, and the other. But anyway, what they said, the rupee should be strong. What does that mean? You know, that it should not, it should not be allowed to depreciate. Now you don't have the money. What would you do? The most interesting thing was that I could ring up the then finance minister of BJP, who had worked earlier in some capacity in the government, and he was a former IAS officer, I think. And that please instruct your party members not to say a word on the exchange rate until tomorrow afternoon. I'm coming to Delhi. Please arrange a meeting with you, Prime Minister, and whoever is in charge, those statement makers. I said, I was not, I mean, must have used very polite language. And that we have to have a meeting because we have to take extraordinary measures to tackle this problem. So a meeting was arranged, and by the, you know, the usual governmental system. I didn't know them at that particular point of time, I can tell you. Then there was this discussion about exchange rate policy and so on and so forth. And I explained to them. And the final clincher, I must say, the Prime Minister backed. I mean, he was listening, actually. He could have easily said, no, 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 no. Rupee should be strong. Then where would you go? So the most interesting episode, after these people made their points, and yeah, woo, you know, something, something. So I said, sir, the only difference between India and Pakistan, and that was the clincher, I'm sorry to mention this, is that they have $1 billion with US with them. You may remember the nuclear thing at that particular point of time. And we have $20 billion without the US. So if you ask me to control the rupee's value at a particular level, I can tell you I would lose it within, these are all within these walls, you know, within 2 weeks. And then what would you do? That was the clinching argument when everybody said, then what, then what? Then one of these pioneers of a hard rupee or a strong rupee asked, so then I was told that, you see, please do whatever you do, want to, whatever you think is appropriate, but take. And one of these people, he said, where will rupee go? I said 100. He said, 100? So I said, if you ask me, if you give me a target, I can't respect it. Because then the market would be against, if they know what the target of the Indian rupee is, it can never be maintained. But we were given authority to do what we want to do. And we took very strong measures, including, you know, there was a lot of criticism about India going for Indian development bond well before the crisis. There was a lot of criticism of India going for India resurgent bond, and people can differ with the views. The point I'm making, sorry to be so long and so anecdotal, and particularly on that episode, that what it requires is a complete harmony. After all, macroeconomic policy, politics, who are you responsible to? Parliament, you know, who is responsible? Who speaks for the RBI? The government. So unless you have a completely harmonious relationship, and if you have a difficult problem which requires tough measures, I mean, then that is the crucial issue. You may be wrong, but then you have to revise your views and so on and so forth. That is different. So there is no, so this, sorry to have gone at such great length, but what I'm, you know, I mean, you can, this is my obsession just now, at the moment, is that how would you tackle emerging problems? That you raised about growth and inflation. These are very relatively mild issues just now. Should it be 6%? Should it be 6.5%? Should it be 5.4%? Should it be 6 or 7%? And should fiscal deficit be 5.3 or 5.5? Should interest rate, where people are borrowing at today 16, so could it be 15.75? RBI is, you know, preventing growth. that 0.25 basis points would as if change expectations. What would change expectations is that if there is a, sorry.
No, sir. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank
Let
you
me
for
stop.
that big perspective on this narrow question, but the throwback to the history and the challenges of your time are very instructive. And I've just realized that you can't talk about growth, inflation, external sector in compartments as I intended to. They're seamlessly interconnected, and we started talking about inflation and the external sector even as we were discussing growth. And of course, the Reserve Bank, as all of you know, has been trying to restrain inflation for the last 2 years, 2.5 years. And there's been criticism against the Reserve Bank's anti-inflationary policy. People have said that you have not been able to restrain inflation, but you have restrained growth and completely derailed it. We have our own arguments from the Reserve Bank side, which is that to promote growth, sustainable growth, steady growth, high growth, you need low and stable inflation, and that low and stable inflation is a necessary condition for sustained growth. So I have a couple of questions on inflation. Taking off from what Dr. Jalan said, I want to ask Dr. Reddy, every time we keep saying in our statements that our goal of inflation is 5%. In the long term, we want to go even down below 5%. In one policy review, I said, look, it's become too cliched, we will remove it. Actually, we removed it, and people caught on to it. Our analysts are so sharp that they caught on to it and said, has the Reserve Bank given up on the target? And therefore, I said, oh my God, I made a mistake, we put it back. But now, at the end of my term in the Reserve Bank, people are asking me increasingly, do you think you're climbing up a wrong tree? Is it not stupid to say that you're going to aim for 5% or below 5% when 7% looks like the new normal? My question to you, sir, is 7% or anything higher than 5% the new normal for inflation? Should the Reserve Bank change its language and change its objective?
First, thank you. Actually, I plead guilty. It was one of those policies where I had indicated 4 to 5%, if I'm not mistaken, as the medium-term goal. If I recall, the sentence there was, in order to have more globalization, if you want to integrate the Indian economy with the global economy, the Indian inflation should not be out of alignment with the global inflation. So that was the context. So if I would say that I would revisit that statement.
Are you saying you would?
I would revisit that statement because the logic is the link between, the difference between the global economy, the global economy, inflation. And secondly, the reason why I had to put is there was a lot of pressure on inflation targeting, and Dr. Jalan was the first to say that it doesn't make sense, but at the same time, people try to say that it's too vague. So in a way, instead of the government imposing inflation target, I was trying to say that this is what we are trying to do. So it's a self-imposed inflation target, which could be reasonably flexible given the circumstances to peg the inflation expectations. Second, it should not be out of alignment with the global inflation. I recall we had discussions with Dr. Rangarajan also on that. So I would say, if you ask me way forward, I think we have to revisit the situation in the context of the new normal inflation, and I believe the new normal for the global inflation will be definitely higher than the pre-crisis. So I think the exercise has to be redone. And secondly, the inflation targeting, which was the fashion of the day, both domestically and globally, there's a lot more tilt towards flexible inflation targeting. And thirdly, globally, policy circles have realized that to have counter-cyclical policies, to have effective counter-cyclical policies, you may require a slightly higher than what was considered to be ideal at 1.5%, 2%. And if I'm not mistaken, even USA is trying to go towards the higher of the end. So I think for these three reasons, you have definitely a case to revisit, but I would not advocate completely giving up some sort of the intention, other things being equal.
Dr. Rangarajan was eager to comment, but I wanted to ask him a question before he comments. But first on Dr. Reddy's answer, certainly we will reflect on what you've said. I'm not saying that definitively that we will change the numbers, but we will certainly revisit our strategy in the light of what you've said. You've been prophetic on many things. Perhaps you'll be prophetic on this also, which is that the global inflation post-crisis will be higher than pre-crisis. But taking off from what you said about inflation targeting, I have a question for Dr. Rangarajan, who is probably, it is one blue-blooded monetary economist in the country, that is Dr. Rangarajan. And my question to you, sir, is the following, which is that you have said not exactly in this language, but to imply that the Reserve Bank should be an inflation targeter. Because if the Reserve Bank doesn't focus on inflation target and focuses on too many objectives, it cannot deliver on any one of them. That you must agree on an inflation target with the government, like in England, and deliver on that. Of course, in the Reserve Bank, we have an institutional stand on that. I will not go into it. But I want to ask you, given that we are a poor country where inflation is a regressive tax, especially on the poor, there's a very strong argument for making the Reserve Bank a pure inflation targeter, stripped of all other objectives. So would you, in your own words, say whether we should become an inflation targeter? And also comment on whether our new normal for inflation should be higher than what the Reserve Bank is now saying it should be.
I think it is dangerous to characterize people and put them in boxes. So I have unfortunately earned the name of an inflation hawk in this country, even though it was only 1 year in which we really fought against inflation in the period 96, 97. But for historical record, I think it must be noted that prior to that, we were running inflation not at 6, 7%, but at the rate of 10 and 12% and 13%. And therefore, I had no choice at that time to let inflation remain at extraordinarily high levels. And therefore, I had to make the point of bringing down the inflation to more respectable levels. In fact, the break in inflation that happened in 1997, 96, 97, somewhere around that region, is the first time the back of inflation was broken in this country. And from that time onwards, I have to say that the inflation has not gone back to that level except occasionally. Therefore, I do attach a great deal of importance to controlling inflation as part of the mandate of the Reserve Bank. But as far as inflation targeting is concerned, I don't think the pure inflation targeters would regard what I say as inflation targeting. I think the argument there is that the Reserve Bank or the central bank of the country has only one objective, and it is written in such a way that the inflation does not exceed that particular level and so on. That has not been the view that I have been taking. But I have been taking the view that while the central bank, like any other arm of the government, can have multiple objectives, there should be a hierarchy among the objectives, and I have repeatedly taken the position that the dominant objective of monetary policy is to control inflation. I think there is a distinction between what I say and what the inflation targeters would say. I have always taken the view that the primary objective and an important objective, the dominant objective, that's the word that I always use, has been this. In fact, the word threshold inflation, I must take credit. I think it was just used by me for the first time in one of the monetary policy statements. And I wrote about it at that time as to how to compute the threshold inflation. The level beyond which the costs of inflation exceed. Therefore, that is how I do. Therefore, if you ask my view, yes, I consider control of inflation as a very dominant, as an important objective of monetary policy. And if you give me a list of objectives, I would put inflation control as the top of those objectives. That is somewhat different from being an inflation targeter. And I would say, if you have to use the word inflation targeting, I would say soft inflation targeting, in the sense that, yes, you must have some idea of where the Reserve Bank or the central bank of the country is going. Otherwise, you can justify any situation that ends and say, this is all what that can be done. I think there should be something towards it. But on one sense, on the new normal, I don't think that we should really alter the indicative number very much beyond what we now have. I don't think that, in fact, at the present moment, the inflation level in the developed economies is low, in fact. And I do not think that the inflation levels will rise very much for several years to come in the developed economies. And therefore, even using the yardstick of our inflation staying in alignment with, in some margin with the other things, I do not think that there is a case for revising the indicative numbers that you have been showing.
Thank you, sir. Disagreement is the heart of panel discussions such as this, so I'm glad I take pride in having generated some disagreement here. I want to bring in Dr. Jalan on this. I know he's very eager to comment, but before I must say that just like Dr. Rangarajan introduced threshold inflation, Dr. Jalan introduced this multiple indicator approach in the Reserve Bank. For the last 4.5 years, I've been asking around what is this multiple indicator approach, and our people tell me that this is what Dr. Jalan did. I still don't understand. Only tell us inflation targeting, multiple indicator approach, new normal for inflation.
I don't know it either. I mean, what the situation was. The only limited point that I wanted to make is that when you are thinking about normal, new normal, and so on and so forth, I think you have to think about it, not what is happening, but it is an ex ante understanding of what is going on the ground in our economy, in our system, and so on. You know, why did we think about 4 or 5% as being the normal earlier, rather than 2, 0, 0.5 or something? The whole thing was that you have procurement prices of food being fixed every year; they are raised based on whatever the criteria is, but you will find procurement prices of food are fixed. Then we have the institutional structure for food supply, where it is expensive. Second, fiscal deficit, fiscal borrowing, subsidies on this, that, and the other. So you have to put all together ex ante and say that what is a feasible level of these fundamentals, as it were, and then decide on, yes, 4 or 5%. Trade unions in the older system, you had organized sector which set the pattern, you had, you know, whatever. And so after you have taken these political, economic, fundamental realities into account, you set a normal. Now, if you say that I am changing my so-called norm because I am not able to control inflation, either because I take it that fiscal deficit should be unbridled, I take it that procurement prices should be raised by 30, 40%, then of course, you should take it as normal, that 10%, 20%. Brazil used to have 100% as normal at one point of time. So you have to take what I'm trying to get at, Subbarao, is essentially that the norms in India haven't changed. It is the actual practice of doing things and saying, yes, pehle aap, or pehle do something that this is Reserve Bank's responsibility, this is this responsibility, this is that. It is the aggregate responsibility of the policy makers. So it is not a question that the biggest priority of the Reserve Bank should be inflation, and the biggest priority of the government of India should be fiscal deficit or subsidies or financing growth. So they are going for growth, they are going for fiscal deficit, they are going for subsidies, and I am going for inflation. I am looking at you. Why this divided responsibility? In a country like ours, where the public sector is extremely important, government borrowing is extremely important, fiscal deficit is extremely important, subsidies are extremely important, decided by whom? Reserve Bank. So how can you, this sort of segmenting responsibilities I don't believe in. I mean, you have to bring it together, given our context, given the kind of society, politics, given the kind of governance system that we have. You can't say that public sector doesn't matter. If the government says that the public sector surplus or cash-rich public sector companies would do something else, what would you do? Or banks, public sector banks should do something else, what would you do? If they say that procurement prices should increase by 10% when the inflation is 6%, if they say that my oil subsidies will not be, will remain, LPG would be 6, something would be X, something would be Y, what would you do? I mean, so they don't think of new norm as something which is in your hands, Mr. Subbarao, Dr. Subbarao, Governor Subbarao. That you have to say that what is the fundamentals, ex ante, that you have to accept. You have to accept for the poor some subsidies, certainly, on oil, something else, but not for everybody. You see what I mean? Yes. You have to accept the fiscal deficit will be X. Government borrowings, because they have to finance all 6 public sector units. That it can't be 2% or 1% or 0% or 0.5, it will be 4 or 5. And then
hall meeting in Chandigarh about a year and a half ago, and we called young people, young professionals, postgraduate students, research scholars to ask the Reserve Bank questions. It was live on telecast. And when we asked them what is important to you, growth or inflation, almost 95% of them said growth. 3 or 4 weeks before that, we had a town hall meeting in Chennai, where the questioners or the audience was middle-class families, low middle-class families from Chennai, and higher-aged people, so middle-aged. And we asked them what's important to you, growth or inflation, and they all said inflation, 95% of them. So I keep introspecting myself, and I tell our senior staff in the Reserve Bank that we've got to understand this country, the demographic profile of this country. The median age of the country is 29 years. Do we, in the Reserve Bank, as an institution, understand the priorities, preferences, aspirations of the majority of this country? At this time, I want to take an audience poll on the Reserve Bank, on the growth versus inflation debate. The question is, RBI should continue to focus on inflation, or RBI must, at this point, shift bias towards growth? Okay, that's the either-or question. And the RBI staff here are disenfranchised. They cannot vote. So for the rest of you, how many of you think that RBI should continue to focus on inflation? Very good. I see that's about 60%. How many should shift bias? How many think that RBI should shift bias towards growth? Okay, I would think that's about 70 to 30%. Because some of you cannot look back, I estimate you to trust me. Okay. Thank you very much. Now, we talked about growth and inflation. Yes.
Caveat is that RBI should focus on inflation because the government won't.
No, that's, anyway. I want to move to some external sector questions because we talked about growth and inflation. We know that the current account deficit last year at 4.2% of GDP was historically the highest. The expectation is that this year it might be lower, not much lower. It's not clear. We still do not have the second quarter numbers. They'll come out shortly. But one thing is clear, which is that for about 15 to 18 years after we started the reforms in the early 90s, our external sector became very robust. We almost forgot about it as the bulwark of our economic strength, even as we had fiscal weaknesses, even as we had inflation, even as we had other problems, the external sector was a strong support. But over the last 2-3 years, that has changed. As we all know, our external sector is now more vulnerable than before, certainly. and also more vulnerable than we thought it could be. My first question to Dr. Rangarajan, again, so you comment a lot on the current account deficit. I've read your ECGC lecture, which is by far the most comprehensive discourse on our current external sector challenges. One sentence from that speech I want to quote. You said in that speech, what is particularly worrying is that we are in a situation of rising CAD in the midst of a slowing economy. Note those adjectives, rising CAD in the midst of a slowing economy. We all understand that we can afford a rising CAD when the economy is growing. But when the economy is slowing down, a rising CAD is a particularly difficult, egregious problem. But as I wrote to you after I read your speech, I wish you had elaborated on that argument. So can you please tell us why we should worry more about a rising CAD in a situation of slowing growth?
Well, the reason why I wrote that was that perhaps when the economy is growing strongly, the need for imports rise faster, and therefore we can get a situation in which the current account deficit could become larger. Therefore, and to some extent, probably that the financing of that current account deficit also becomes easier when the outside perception is that it is a growing economy. Therefore, two things happen. Therefore, the situation is that what is really happening in the case of a slowing economy is that the imports are rising at a time when the growth is not very strong, and perhaps your exports are not also rising, and therefore this puts you in a very difficult situation, both in terms of the level of the current account deficit, and more importantly in financing the current account deficit. After all, what we have been seeing in the recent years is that up to 2007-8, the current account deficit was below 2% of the GDP, around there. And that we had even indicated earlier that 2.5% of the GDP would be a sustainable current account. It is only in the recent period you find this sharp rise in the current account deficit, and the ability of financing that current account deficit becomes a question mark as this rises, and if it is compounded by the fact that the economy is slowing.
Thank you, sir. You've triggered my next question, which is that you've said in your speech that 2.3% is the sustainable current account deficit. Reserve Bank's own research shows that about 2.5% is the sustainable current account deficit. But Dr. Reddy, as always, has thought differently. In one of the speeches that he gave about a year ago, he said that the country must aim for zero current account deficit. Zero current account deficit. I was a bit surprised. Two questions on that. One, should we aim for 0% current account deficit? Given that we are a poor economy, we need foreign savings. Second, can we get 0% current account deficit? I know the usual mathematical way of answering this. How do we get to 0%? We raise exports, reduce imports, and raise invisibles. But can you flesh out that answer a little more? But what should be the strategy for reducing the current account deficit?
Thank you very much. First, few facts. 2003, 2008, growth was around 8.9%. Inflation was around 5%. And if I'm not mistaken, interest rates were always increased. The association that reduction in interest rate will necessarily bring about higher growth or lower inflation may not be right. So it depends, and Dr. Jalan in a way referred to that. So the instrumentality of interest rate as something which has a determining influence on growth and or inflation. We have to use it cautiously. 5 years may not be a long period, but that's what it is. Not once interest rates were reduced, number one. Second, the same thing applies to current account deficit. If I'm not mistaken, during that period, the average current account deficit was 0.3%. 0.3%, if I'm not mistaken. So again, we have to first remove the shocks. My own submission would be, first we have to remove the shocks, which can explain whether it's 0.3, positive shock, or 3%, negative shock. I have no problem with that. Second, 2% CAD, which was again propounded by Dr. Rangarajan when he was the chairman of the Balance of Payments Committee. At that point of time, that estimate was made, A, considering the global situation, and two, the absorptive capacity, in my view. And I have been a party to that, and at some stage as Deputy Governor, I said it could be more, 3 to 4%. But after the global crisis, I think we have to revisit. One of the things we have to see after the global crisis is we have to provide for shocks. We are vulnerable for food shocks, we are vulnerable to fuel shocks, and we are vulnerable to capital flow shock. Because whenever anything happens in the capital flow, it's a stock adjustment. It's not just flow. And the stock adjustments in capital account can be huge. Also, so therefore, I would make a distinction between the average and the cycle. So in a way, the question is, do you want an average of 2? Then at the time of shock, it may be 3.5. So how sustainable it will be? That's the first issue. The second issue is that if you see the record, unlike official flows, it will be very interesting. I don't have definite data, but it will be very interesting to see those countries which have depended on the difference between FDI and portfolio flows. So if you have more volatile component in the flows which finance current account deficit. So considering all these factors, the uncertainty is the way forward. 0 is a dramatic way of putting it, but 2% cannot be the average. If 2% is average, then during shock it may go to 4%. Two things, we have seen what happens when it approaches 4%. Second, what happened in the G20 discussion? India and USA may not have agreed, but majority of the countries were inclined to go along with a virtual ceiling of 4% of current account deficit and current accounts. So therefore, my submission is we have to revisit both the idea that foreign savings are critical for higher economic growth, number one. Two, that the current sustainable current account deficit can be considered without relevance to the shocks.
Thank you. At this time, one audience question on the external sector, only on the external sector. One hand which went up, went down. So there are no questions on the external sector anywhere from, yes, I see you from the right, the third row from behind, white shirt. Will you, yes, you only, will you please stand up and ask your question? Please introduce yourself.
My name is Manish, and I was a student of IGIDR at one point. My question is, how do we achieve this balance? I mean, how will we have this 2% cap on deficit in tough times? That's what I'm reading. And what are we thinking on the gold front? I mean, obviously in alignment with the finance ministry, but what are we doing with regard to gold imports down the line?
So since you are the proponent of 0% or average of 0%, 2%, please answer.
If you agree that the second part you will answer. So then I am prepared to. You see, basically the issue is in terms of designing the strategies. I'm not talking about what the Reserve Bank does, but I presume that in terms of designing the strategies of development, you do have the whole instrumentality of policy, unless you say that we can do nothing about savings, investment, or current account deficit. I presume that that is not the issue. So whether fiscal policy or monetary policy or exchange rate policy, whether all of them are driving towards a framework. And in that framework, whether we proceed on the assumption that higher growth can be achieved with 3% CAD or 4%. A 5-year, 12th five-year plan assumes, I think, on average 3.5. So is it okay? Do we expect the financial markets to support an average of 3.5 in some years which may be 4 or 4.2, subject to correction? That's the only question. What instruments have to be used, unless you feel that nothing can be done? It can be done, whether it's a fiscal instrument or the exchange rate.
So Manish, I have some homework for you. I have no answer, but you will write us a paper, a 3-page note to the governor of RBI on how to bring current account deficit down, okay? Because I need an answer from you especially. Now, I have one question, which is, I have a lot of questions on the external sector, but for want of time, we will not address them. But again, I want to take an audience poll on this issue of the external sector. There is one view that the RBI has not been adventurous enough on capital account opening. We've been very cautious, very timid, very measured, and that's not good for the country. The other view is that indeed we've not been liberal enough, that we should be more courageous, more bold, more adventurous, and open up the capital account. And as always, we say that our policy is festina lente, which is Latin for make haste slowly. That's the Reserve Bank's policy. But I want to ask you, how many of you think that the Reserve Bank should be more liberal in opening up the capital account? More liberal, all the adjectives associated with liberal. We should be more adventurous, more progressive, more dynamic, more courageous on opening up the capital account. Okay, that's just about less than 10. How many think that we should be more cautious? We should be more cautious, or our policy at the right time is the right balance? I'm sorry, that's 3 questions. Okay. How many of you think our current balance is okay? All right. How many of you think that we should be more cautious? All right. So again, the median answer, by far, big median answer is that our current balance is just about right. I have a few questions. Because we can't round this up, I'll just take 10 more minutes. We talked about growth, we talked about inflation, we talked about the external sector. We've got to talk about the big elephant in the room, which is the fiscal deficit. Our discussion will not be complete if we don't talk about it. One of the things that keeps coming up is that we've been shouting from rooftops that the fiscal time bomb is going to burst sometime, and it's a big, big elephant in the room. Stan Fisher, who's the governor of the Bank of Israel, I keep seeing him in some international conferences. He told me, Subha, you people have kept talking about fiscal deficit for the last 15 years, that your economy is going to collapse, and raising this false alarm. Nothing has happened. So do you think that you should still be talking about this high fiscal deficit as a bad thing for the economy? So I want to ask Dr. Rangarajan. So you've been in the helm of economic management for the last 20, 25 years. You saw the 90s, you've seen the 2000s, you're now seeing the 2010s. What is it different this time that fiscal deficit is going to have a pernicious influence on economic management? It did not happen last time. But why is fiscal deficit much more of a bomb, a problem now than before?
Well, the position that we have been taking over the last 15 years or 2 decades is that the fiscal deficit should be moderated at an appropriate level. I think there is a distinction between saying that we should work towards zero fiscal balance and trying to talk about an appropriate level of fiscal deficit. That is why the FRBM Act talked of 3% of the GDP as the appropriate level of fiscal deficit for the Government of India. And consequent upon the recommendations of the 12th Finance Commission, almost all state governments passed similar legislations, and they said 3% of the state GDP. So virtually we are talking about is 6% of the GDP as the appropriate level of fiscal deficit. Therefore, this is very different from arguing as if that there is no need, that we have a balance and we should not have a fiscal deficit. I think if we get beyond 6% of the fiscal deficit, 6% of the GDP as a combined fiscal deficit, we are running into some problems. We arrived at 6% of the GDP as a fiscal deficit by looking at the household savings in financial assets. The household savings in financial assets is roundly about 11%. In fact, it has come down recently, but it has been about 11%. Therefore, we thought that if 6% of that is preempted in the form of fiscal deficit, it will leave another 5% for not only the private sector, but also the public sector enterprises, because in this 6%, public sector enterprises are not there. Therefore, that is the level of fiscal deficit, which is consistent with the level of household savings in financial assets. Therefore, there is a logic behind the number that we are really talking about it. And if the fiscal deficit tries to run above that particular level, you remember that you and I jointly wrote a piece which is called The Importance of Being Earnest About Fiscal Deficit. And that's the title of the thing. And therefore, what we are essentially arguing is that don't get beyond this. And there is sufficient reason for saying why it should be 6% rather than the Maastricht rate of 3%. Because it has, our savings rate, our domestic savings rate is far higher than the savings rate of those countries. And therefore, there is some relationship between the fiscal deficit or the desired level of fiscal deficit and the domestic savings rate. So that is why we say. Now, there is an argument going on in the Western countries about what growth versus austerity. The problem really there is that they are at such a bad situation that fiscal consolidation or fiscal austerity at this particular point can bring about serious deterioration in the growth, and therefore there is an argument going on there, and the argument is not settled. But the position is very different in India. I think here growth is slowing, but I do believe that working towards the level indicated that would also mean that the overall savings rate also can go up, which is what we desire in order to promote the investment rate. Therefore, I would really draw attention to the fact that we are talking about a fiscal deficit, an appropriate level of fiscal deficit at 6% of the GDP, both center and the states taken together. And that is a level of fiscal deficit justified by our domestic savings rate and justified by the demand from the various other sectors. That is why we are afraid that when it exceeds this level, it causes a damage.
Thank you, sir, for a very perceptive answer. I want this audience to benefit from Dr. Jalan's public policy perspective on the fiscal deficit issue. We all know that our fiscal deficit is not a cyclical thing, it's structural, and this quick fix band-aid solutions will not work. We are deluding ourselves by some accounting fixes, some numbers to bring down fiscal deficit, but what we should be worrying about is the structural nature of this fiscal deficit and the structural solution to a structural problem. So 3 short questions to you, sir. First, do you agree that our current strategy of fiscal reduction is somewhat of a band-aid solution? Second, we all agree that subsidies must be brought down in order to redress the fiscal imbalance problem, but how do we address them from a political economy perspective? And third, can you tell us if this cash transfer of subsidies starting 1st January, is that going to be a game changer, not from a political perspective, but from a public finance management perspective?
Thank you again. I think of the 3 questions, so far as the first item is concerned, which was fiscal deficit is whether it's a problem, not a problem. Was that the first?
That was the question to him, but
yeah.
whether band-aid solutions will work for a structural fiscal deficit problem.
No. The short answer is no. But what the fiscal deficit should be and shouldn't be is the central issue, which we have discussed at length, and I think Dr. Rangarajan has pointed out. What is it rising from? I mean, that is the essential question. And what is the structural and what is cyclical? That is the most important question. And so far as the structural issue is concerned, you are absolutely, I am of the view that if it is fiscal deficit is high because of reasons of public policy making, which you refer to, and because of inability to control expenditure or transfer the benefits to the people which it is supposed to benefit, then obviously it's going to run wild somewhere down the line. Unless you hit a crisis. Once you hit a crisis, you will have to correct the fiscal deficit because you can't import, you can't export, you can't do anything, and inflation is high. So the question, the central issue is that what do you do with, if there is an organic problem with fiscal deficit before a crisis arises in managing your finances? So there is no doubt in my mind, and I think there can be no two answers to this, that fiscal deficit has to be at a reasonable level, within inverted commas, reasonable. Yeah. Because ultimately, if it is not at a reasonable level, you would get into a problem like the US, or you can get into a problem like some of the other countries, which are debt servicing itself is generating a huge crisis. So the central issue I want to point to you is that how to, some fiscal deficit is unavoidable in our kind of a situation where government is a large borrower in the system, but what it borrows for is essential. Public delivery is essential. And if it is expanding, so I'm in favor of a strict control of fiscal deficit for psychological reasons, for public policy reasons. Because if you say, no, fiscal deficit doesn't matter, then you can be sure that it won't matter. And we can get ourselves into the kind of issues which several other countries in the world have got. But what the number should be, what it is, can only be decided by going back into why is this fiscal deficit arising. And I think Dr. Rangarajan was right that if it can get out of hand, then it will be very wrong. Now, cash transfer, because there is a built-in incentive for fiscal deficit. I mean, that is political incentive. So if you put some threshold or something or some cap, it helps. And there is a media agitation that fiscal deficit is going, then they would take some more difficult action. On the cash transfer, I mean, it's of course a huge, one is a theoretical answer, the other is the administrative issues involved. I think in principle, cash transfer is a good thing because of the diversion, that if your PDS benefit to the poor, what you call the BPL, below poverty line people, if according to Planning Commission, 48% of it is diverted in terms of grain, then how do you reduce that? Now, whether cash transfers, so-called cash transfers, would actually reduce it or not, I don't know. Because the system has to be, is extremely elaborate system, has to be set up because of illiteracy, because of lack of access to bank accounts, because of the dominance of money lenders in rural areas. So if you create intermediary systems, then it can be injurious to the people. And the second issue, which has also been raised, is whether what you spend cash on is of utmost importance to the rural households. Because the research work that has been done is with the wherever there is higher female literacy, the diversion of PDS grain is lower. I mean, this is not my finding, this is the finding of those who have studied this question. Ravi is there, and they have all studied this issue. So I think it's a complex, it's a complex question. In principle, in theory, it's a good thing. But whether it works in practice is an Indian thing.
Thank you, sir. The last question for Dr. Reddy. So it's a very short question, and I request you to give a short answer. Is monetary policy coming under fiscal dominance?
It has always been so.
Several governors, including you, Dr. Rangarajan, you've all attempted to bring it out of fiscal dominance. We believed that we were getting out of it. But is there a concern that it is coming back or we're regressing on the path of getting out of fiscal dominance?
I think Dr. Jalan has really answered. The reality of Indian situation is that whatever the results can be achieved have to be together. And finally, fiscal is the sovereign prerogative. You can crib, you can cry, you can do. So in a way, the monetary authorities complaining about fiscal is practically trying to say that I'm not having the degrees of freedom that I have, given the exercise of sovereignty in terms of the level of fiscal deficit.
Thank you very much. That brings to a close this panel discussion, but one final question for the audience. We talked about growth, we talked about inflation, we talked about the external sector, we talked about raising the savings rate. So those are the 4 things. From a policy perspective, controlling inflation, accelerating growth, make the rupee stronger, or raise the savings rate. If I asked you on those 4 objectives, which is the most important one, you can only choose one. How many for controlling inflation? Quite a lot. Accelerating growth? Fewer. Make the rupee strong, which is, a broad brush phrase for take care of the external sector. Ashima is the only patriot. And raise the savings rate? Okay. I realize that these are not independent objectives. They're all they're together, and you can't control one without affecting the other. But I just thought that we should get a flavor of the sense of priority. So thank you very much for listening very patiently. I want to, on behalf of IGIDR, I want to thank all the panelists for a very erudite, very informative, very knowledgeable, and a very wise discussion. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, on behalf of the panel, may I thank you. I have seldom seen such, so what you might call such a broad range of issues being discussed within such a short time, and with your interventions, etc., as well as involving the audience. So I must congratulate you, and I must thank you that for a superb session that you've conducted by not trying to make fools of your colleagues or former colleagues, okay, but trying to elicit. Yeah, thank you.
I
thank you, Subbarao.
Dr. Subbarao and all the panelists.